The chambers beneath the sand asleep story chapter. 1. The night before the excavation. The desert at night is not what most people imagine when they think of deserts. Most people imagine heat and blinding light, and the slow, punishing weight of the sun, and all of that is true of the desert in the day. But at night, the desert becomes something else entirely, something that I had been coming back to for 15 years. And that still surprised me every time, the way a piece of music you have loved for a long time can still surprise you in its most familiar passages. I was sitting outside my tent on a folding chair with a cup of tea going cold in my hand and looking at the sky above the Valley of the Kings. And the sky was doing what the desert sky does at night, which is to become more sky than sky. Is anywhere else the stars not just numerous, but present in a way that city dwellers and even most country dwellers never experience, present as a physical fact, as a ceiling so close and so detailed that reaching up seemed not entirely absurd. The camp was quiet. My team had gone to sleep 2 hours ago. Tomorrow was the day we had been working toward for 3 years of planning and 2 years of excavation. And everyone needed rest, and I had needed it too. But sleep had not come, and eventually I had stopped pretending it might, and had come outside to sit with the night, and the tea, and the immensity of the sky. Tomorrow we would open the door. We had found it 6 weeks ago, by accident, though there had been an element of luck in it, but by following a chain of reasoning that had begun with a fragment of papyrus in a collection in Berlin that had never been properly translated, and that when I finally spent the time with it, had described in the oblique and elusive language of ancient administrative documents a chamber that was not on any map of this tomb, not in any of the records of the previous excavations that had worked this site across the past 150 years. I had read that phrase perhaps 1,000 times, since the place where the king keeps what the king does not wish found. I looked up at the stars and thought about what might be on the other side of that door. And after a while, the tea was completely cold, and I set it down on the sand beside my chair, and I tilted my head back and let the stars fill my entire field of vision. And I breathed and thought about the 3,000 years that lay between me and the person who had sealed that chamber, and what it might mean to cross that distance tomorrow morning. And I was aware of something I could only describe as the specific weight of. Eventually, I went back inside the tent and lay down on my cot and stared at the canvas above me and listened to the desert making its small night sounds. And at some point, sleep found me after all. Chapter 2, the door. We had cleared the last of the debris from in front of the door the previous afternoon and covered it with a protective tarpaulin. And now, in the early morning light, with the sun still low and the air still carrying the desert's night coolness, my team stood before it and looked at it, and no one spoke for a moment. It was not what I had expected. I had expected something like the sealed doorways I had seen in other tombs in this valley, blocked with limestone blocks, and plastered over, and stamped with the necropolis seal, the jackal, and the 9 captives that told you officially and formally that what lay beyond was not meant to be disturbed. This door was different. It was cut directly into the living rock of the valley wall, as if the rock itself had been persuaded to open, and then persuaded to close again. And the surface of the rock around the opening had been worked smooth in a way that was almost invisible to the eye. You only knew it had been worked because when you ran your fingers over it, as I had done dozens of times in the past weeks, you could feel the faint traces of tools in a surface that would otherwise have looked entirely natural. And across the surface of this worked stone, there was writing, not hieroglyphs, something older. I had shown photographs to 3 colleagues who specialized in ancient Egyptian scripts, and all 3 had said the same thing, which was that they had never seen this particular form of writing before, and that it appeared to be older than any hieroglyphic tradition. They knew a proto-script, perhaps something from a period before the writing systems they studied had fully developed, and none of them had been able to read it. We stood before the door. The morning air smelled of dust, and something else, something dry and mineral that I had come to associate with deep desert rock, the smell of stone that had not been touched by air or water for a very long time. I gave the signal to begin chapter 3. The first passage, the door had not been sealed with mortar or plaster. It had been sealed with precision. The stone that formed the door fitted into its frame with a tolerance that a modern engineer would have respected, each edge worked to a flatness that allowed no gap for air to pass through, no gap for moisture, no gap for the fine desert sand that found its way into everything. It had taken us 4 hours to open it, not because it was heavy, though it was heavy cut from a single piece of limestone that the structural survey estimated at almost 2 tons, but because we were being careful, because whatever was on the other side of this door had been on the other side for 3,000 years, and we were not going to rush, and we were not going to damage anything, and every movement was documented and measured and recorded before the next one was made. When it finally moved, when the stone pivoted on the mechanism that someone 3,000 years ago had designed for precisely this purpose, a pivot point of extraordinary engineering, so well balanced that despite its weight, the door moved smoothly on a single fulcrum point cut into the floor and ceiling. When it moved and the air from inside met the air from outside, for the first time in 3,000 years, we all stopped. The smell that came out of that darkness was extraordinary. not the smell of decay, not the smell of death, though I had smelled both in tombs and knew them. Well, this was something different, something that had been sealed in a small space for so long that it had become its own specific thing, the accumulated exhalation of 3,000 years of absolute stillness of stone and ancient wood and materials I could not yet identify, and underneath everything a sweetness that I later identified as the sacred incense of ancient Egypt, whose recipe had been lost for two. We stood in the entrance and let the air move past us, and then I turned on and stepped inside chapter for the first chamber. The first thing the light found was gold. Not a small amount of gold, not the gold of jewelry or amulets, though those were there too, but gold as a structural element, gold as a material decision made at the level of architecture. The walls of the first chamber were lined with gold panels, each one perhaps 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, fitted together with the same precision as the door, and covering every surface of the chamber from the floor to the ceiling, so that the beam of my did not illuminate a wall. It was reflected back from a wall. And I stood in the entrance to the chamber and did not move for a long time behind me. I could hear my team breathing. The gold panels were not plain. Each one was covered in incised decoration, worked into the gold with tools so fine that the lines were barely wider than a human hair, depicting in continuous narrative scenes that ran from panel to panel around the entire chamber, a story I could not yet read, but whose images I could see and catalog even in that first moment. There were boats on water, there were figures in postures of ceremony and worship, there were animals I recognized, and some I did not. There were stars arranged in patterns that I did not recognize as any of the known astronomical charts of ancient Egypt, and there was a figure that recurred in panel after panel, always larger than the figures around it, always at the center of the action, always depicted in the particular formal posture of kingship, the crook and flail held, crossed over the chest, the double crown on the head, the cartouche beside the figure that I bent forward to read, and that contained a name I had seen before, not one of the great names, not, or Akhenaten, a name from an earlier period, a name that belonged to a king, about whom almost nothing was known, a king who appeared briefly in the records and then disappeared from them with a completeness that historians had always found puzzling, as if someone had decided that this king would not be remembered and had gone to considerable effort to ensure it. And yet here was his chamber, and here was his gold, and here was his story running around the walls of this room in lines finer than a human hair worked by hands that had been dust for 3,000 years. Chapter 5. The second chamber. Beyond the first chamber, there was a passage, narrow enough that I had to turn sideways to move through it, and low enough walls of the passage were not gold, but plain limestone, and in the beam of the limestone showed the marks of the tools that had cut it, the long parallel striations left by copper chisels driven by mallets in the hands of workers who had carved this passage in the dark 3,000 years ago, working by the light of small oil lamps, whose soot I could still see in faint dark patches on the ceiling above the places. The passage turned once to the left and once to the right, and I understood, as I moved through it, that these turns were not accidental, that the passage had been designed to disorient, to make it impossible to know from outside the first chamber what direction the second lay in, to add one more layer of obscurity to what lay beyond. The second chamber was smaller than the first, perhaps 15 feet square, and its walls were not gold, but painted, floor to ceiling in colors that the sealed darkness had preserved with extraordinary fidelity, the blues and greens and reds of ancient Egyptian wall paintings, still vivid, still present, as if the painters had left only yesterday the pigments made from minerals that did not fade from malachite and azurite and carbon black, and the white of finely ground limestone. The paintings showed the afterlife, but not the afterlife I knew from the Book of the Dead, not the familiar scenes of judgment and weighing of hearts and the dangers of the underworld, but something else, something that the figures in the painting moved through with expressions on their painted faces that I had never seen in ancient Egyptian art, which almost never depicted emotion in any direct way, but that I could only describe as wonder. They moved through a landscape that was not Egypt. It was not any landscape I could name blue mountains, that were not any blue mountains on earth rivers, that ran upward a sky that contained multiple suns, none of them the familiar solar disk of Egyptian cosmology, and at the center of the largest panel, a figure I recognized from the gold chamber, the same large central figure, the same cartouche beside it, but here without the formal regalia, without the crook and flail, without the double crown. Here the figure was simply a person standing in that impossible landscape with its multiple suns and upward rivers, and looking at something in the far distance of the painting with an expression that my assistant standing beside me in the narrow chamber put into words before. She said quietly, "He looks like he is finally home." Chapter 6. The Hall of Objects, the third chamber, was not a chamber in the conventional sense. It was a hall, running perhaps 60 feet in length and 20 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough that my beam did not reach it. And along both sides of the hall, standing on low stone plinths, in 2 long rows, facing each other across the central space, were objects. I will try to describe what I saw on my left, beginning at the entrance to the hall. There was a throne, not a replica, not a ceremonial object clearly meant for display, but a throne that showed the wear of use, the surfaces of the armrests smoothed by the contact of hands, the front edge of the seat subtly compressed by the weight of a body that had sat there regularly, the wood beneath the gold leaf slightly checked with age, but still structurally sound, still recognizable for what it had been, which was the place where a person sat when they were being a king. Beside the throne, a chest. The chest was of alabaster so fine that when I held my behind it, I could see the shadow of my hand through the stone. And the chest was sealed with a closure of ivory pins threaded through golden loops, and the ivory had yellowed to the color of old cream, and the gold of the loops was undimmed. Beside the chest, instruments, things that might have been musical instruments, or might have been scientific instruments, or might have been both, or neither, long, slender rods of a metal. I did not immediately recognize, not gold, not copper, not the iron that this period rarely used, but something else, something with a bluish tint that reflected the light differently from any metal I had worked with. Beside the instruments, a model, a scale model of something architectural built with a precision that made me think of the gold panels in the first chamber, the same quality of craft, the same refusal of imprecision. And the model was of a building that was not a temple, and not a palace, and not any structure type I could identify from the architectural record of ancient Egypt, or from any other ancient civilization I was familiar with. A building designed for a purpose I did not know. I walked slowly along the hall between the objects, trying to take in each one individually, trying to give each one the attention it deserved, and finding it difficult because the cumulative effect of so many extraordinary things in the same space was almost overwhelming, not with emotion exactly, but with the very specific cognitive overload of encountering more significant information than the mind can process at the speed it is being presented. At the far end of the hall, there was another passage, and beyond the passage, a faint light. Chapter 7, the source of the light. I thought at first that someone had come in from outside through an entrance we had not found, but the light was not the light of or torches. It was natural light, finding its way down from the surface through a shaft that had been cut in the rock above the fourth chamber, a shaft so narrow and so perfectly oriented that it caught the light of the sun at a specific angle and directed it downward in a single concentrated beam that fell onto the floor of the chamber at precisely the center of a circular design inlaid into the stone. The design was a map, or something that functioned as a map, circular with markings that I recognized as stars, though not in any arrangement I could immediately place in the known astronomical catalogs of ancient Egypt or of any other ancient culture. And at the center of the circular star map, the beam of sunlight fell and was concentrated by a lens of polished crystal set into the floor, at that exact point focused to a brightness that made me look away. After a moment, the way you look away from the sun itself, I stood at the edge of the fourth chamber and looked at the light on the floor. And I thought about the person who had designed this, who had calculated the angle of that shaft with sufficient precision that 3,000 years later it still functioned as designed, who had understood enough about the movement of the sun and the geometry of light and the properties of crystal to build a working optical instrument into the floor of an underground chamber, who had known things that we thought no one in that period could have known, who had been erased from the official record with a thoroughness that suggested not incompetence or misfortune, but deliberate removal, a decision made by someone that this person and this person's knowledge would not be permitted to persist in the record, and whose chamber I was now standing in. Chapter 8. The texts, the walls of the fourth chamber were covered in text, not hieroglyphs, the same proto-script that was on the door, but here in the better light of the solar shaft, and with more time, and with my magnifying glass, I could look at it more carefully, and I began to see structures in it, patterns, that repeated patterns, that varied in systematic ways, patterns that a trained eye could begin to move through the way you move through a landscape before you have learned its names, knowing that you are somewhere even if you cannot yet say where. I photographed everything 647 photographs of text panels. And when I had photographed everything, I sat down on the floor of the fourth chamber in the beam of the solar shaft with my notebook. And I began to work. I cannot translate the text. I want to be precise about this. I cannot translate it in the sense of rendering it into English sentences. I can identify structural patterns. I can identify what appear to be repeated phrases. I can identify what appear to be numerals and what appear to be proper names. And in a few places where the proto-script shows clear derivation from symbols, I know I can make tentative guesses at meaning. But there is one section of text near the entrance to the fourth chamber that I keep returning to, a section that is written differently from the rest, where the inscription is deeper, cut more deliberate, as if whoever made it wanted to be sure it would last, and where the symbols are larger and more widely spaced, and where my tentative and uncertain reading suggests something that I cannot yet confirm, but that I keep thinking about in the long evenings in the camp after the team has gone to sleep. It appears to be an address to someone who has not yet arrived, to someone who will come much later and will find this place and will stand where I am standing and will wonder, as I am wondering, what all of this means. It appears to say, you who find this, we did not hide this because we were afraid. We hid this because the world was not yet ready. Wait until it is chapter 9, the night, after we sealed the chambers again at sunset, not permanently, not in the way they had been sealed, but enough to protect them through the night and to maintain the controlled conditions that the objects inside required. And then we sat outside in the camp, in the cooling air, as the sky went from gold to orange to the deep blue that precedes full darkness. And we did not talk very much. There was too much to say any of it. I had been in extraordinary situations in my career. I had stood in tombs that no living person had entered for 2,000 years. I had held objects that the last hands to touch them had been the hands of people who lived before the Common Era. I had read texts that had not been read for 1,000 years, and felt the particular vertigo of contact with minds separated from mine by spans of time that the imagination could not properly bridge. But this was different. What was in those chambers was different from anything I had experienced in degree, but also in kind, different not just because it was older or better preserved or more numerous, though it was all of those things, but because of the proto-script on the door and the walls, and the implications of that text, if my tentative reading was anywhere near accurate. The people who built this had not been preserving artifacts. They had been preserving knowledge, specific technical knowledge encoded in objects and texts, and in the architectural feature of the solar shaft and the crystal lens, and in the star map on the floor of the fourth chamber, all of it pointing toward an understanding of the world that should not have been possible in the period this tomb dated from, and that had been deliberately concealed, not to be lost, but to be found later when the world, as the text apparently put it, was ready. I sat with this as the stars came out, the same stars that whoever built this had charted and mapped and encoded in the floor of a chamber, and arranged their solar shaft to illuminate once per year. They had looked at these stars from this desert 3,000 years ago, and they had thought about the future with enough clarity and enough faith in that future to hide everything they knew in a room under the sand and wait. Chapter 10. What remains? I am writing this in the camp on the third night. After we opened the chamber, the analysis will take years. The proto-script alone will take years, perhaps decades, and may never be fully translated. And the objects in the hall will each require their own programs of study and conservation. And the architectural analysis of the chambers and the solar shaft and the crystal lens could occupy a team of specialists for a generation. And the star map on the floor of the fourth chamber has already been photographed by 3 different astronomical imaging systems and sent to 4 universities, and none of thee. There will be controversy. There is always controversy. There are people who will not accept the dating, and people who will not accept the implication of the proto-script, and people who will find explanations for the optical instrument that do not require us to revise what we think we know about what was known in this period. And all of that is part of the process, and I accept it and expect it. But I have the photographs, and I have my notebook with its tentative readings, and I have the memory of standing in the beam of that solar shaft in the fourth chamber with the desert above me and 3,000 years below me, looking at a star map that no one alive had seen before, and reading words that had been waiting in the dark for someone to come and read them. You who find this, we did not hide this because we were afraid. We hid this because the world was not yet ready. Wait until it is. I think about those words every night now as the camp goes quiet and the desert cools and the stars come out above the valley. And I find that I do not know whether the world is ready now or whether we are still waiting, and whether 3,000 years is a long time or a short one depends entirely on what you are measuring it against. Against a human life, it is immense. Against the age of the desert, it is nothing. Sand that covers everything here was here before the tomb was built, and it will be here after every trace of our excavation has been smoothed away by wind and time, and somewhere below it, in the dark and the stillness, the chambers will remain as they have remained, the gold still reflecting whatever light finds its way in the painted figures, still moving through their impossible landscape, with their expressions of wonder, the objects still standing in their rows on their low stone plinths, the crystal lens still waiting, and the text still cut into the wall at the entrance to the fourth chamber, patient, unhurried, certain that eventually someone would come. I close my notebook. Outside the tent, the desert is perfectly quiet. The stars are very bright above the valley. The sand is still, and somewhere below it, the chambers keep their long watch in the dark, waiting for the next day and the next year and whatever comes after. And none of it requires anything from me now except sleep, which is what the desert seems to be suggesting, and which after 3 extraordinary days seems not like an ending, but like the most natural thing in the world. The end